Prosecutor Robert Jackson of the United States opens the trial with a strong indictment of the defendants.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility.
One week after the surrender of Japan on September 2nd, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the arrests of Japanese leaders, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. On the morning of September 11th, as soldiers approached Tojo's home, he shot himself with a Colt 32. Tojo survived, and he would stand trial. In this final episode of 1945 from the National World War II Museum, we explore the consequences of World War II. In Nuremberg, 24 leaders of the Third Reich are put on trial, 12 sentenced to death. In Tokyo, 28 officials are charged, 7 sentenced to death. Rich Frank joins Don Miller and I for this final episode of the series. So here we are. I've discussed this with Don. I think World War II is the largest event in human history, not just the largest conflict, not just the largest war, but when you can take into account there's no part of the globe that's not affected. When you take into account the number of people, Don, is it 65 million? Is that the
Well, we're still counting. You know, the Russian archives still have further casualties. You know, it's
in the realm of 65.
Gerhard Weinberg is arguing now that it's almost 70. I'd say 65.
65 million people, fatalities in 6 years, let alone the grievously wounded, people who will never
Two-thirds of them women and children, by the way.
Of the fatalities.
Yeah.
I think it's very important not to focus solely upon what actually happened between 1937 and 1945. What you really have to contemplate, and contemplate very soberly, is exactly what happens if the war just keeps rolling along for months or years. And particularly in the Asia-Pacific theater, where you've got these enormous numbers of Asians dying overwhelmingly by starvation or related things, disease, of course.
Well, and give us a sense of the scope of that. You're saying Asians, but I mean,
right.
List the areas.
Okay. We start with China. China suffers the greatest number of casualties in the Asia-Pacific theater. And there are various numbers that have been advanced about that. The People's Republic of China uses a figure of about 20 million dead and about 10 million injured or disabled. I think a realistic set of numbers for the Asia-Pacific theater is about 25 million total dead. The Japanese civilian deaths, probably, in my view, at high end are about 1 to 1.2 million, which tells you immediately that for every Japanese civilian who died, 18 or nearly 18 others died. They're almost entirely other Asians, non-whites. The biggest group would be the Chinese, probably about 12 million dead there. If you look at that 12 million dead, you could do it this way. You could say, well, okay, it's 12 million dead over 97 months. That's 124,000 every month for 97 months. If you look at what we now call Indonesia, you go at 2.4 million deaths from starvation in 44-45. That's literally about 100,000 every month, plus another 300,000 who die as slave laborers to the Japanese. Then you go to Vietnam, and they have a mass famine in early 1945. At least 1 million dead. The Vietnamese say it's 2 million. The great recent historian about that, Greg Huff, points out that not only was there 1 million dead Vietnamese, but they died primarily between April and August 1945, which is 200,000 dead Vietnamese every month.
And your point is, if the war had rolled on, if we had blockaded and continued the firebombing, not only would Japan have suffered, because Japan still had millions of troops in Asia. Right. Those casualties, those figures, I should say, those fatalities throughout Asia, in Korea, in Indonesia, in China, etc., would have continued.
Right, exactly. And the other thing is, the Koreans in particular had a very near miss with an absolute catastrophe, because as the Japanese did not have food, they were going to strip it out of Korea ruthlessly. And you're talking about, I think it's about 23 million Koreans. You're looking looking at the prospect of millions of deaths.
We often think of the war of World War II being from 1939 to 1945, but in fact, it was really 1937 to 1945.
Yeah, it's a very interesting quandary about how we got into the notion that what happened in China in 1937 was not really the beginning of World War II. It's full scale. We're talking about millions of combatants. It goes on steadily from 37 to 45. It has global implications, not only in Asia but in Europe. It's tied to the conflict between Germany and Japan. There's just all kinds of ways that this is all tied together, and I remain baffled by why we persisted, except for the fact, being very parochial, that the war began either in Europe in September 1939 or for the U.S. in December 1941. Then when we became directly involved, that was when the war began. But that's not how the rest of the globe experienced it.
Let's stay in 1945. Describe what's happening in China.
China by 1945 is in a desperate shape for many reasons, primarily, however, economic and in terms of food. The most effective strategy the Japanese used against the Chinese was economic. And by 41, the Chinese are almost paralyzed in terms of what they can do internally because of the economic collapse and inflation. So China by 1945 is just barely hanging on by a thread.
Going on September, October, into for the rest of the year, the balance of 1945, Japan begins to change in a fundamental way. Can you explain that? Or is that too simple?
I think
it's too complex.
Yeah,
That's not too simple.
And really, when you read the contemporary accounts, I mean, we go for weeks and weeks where we're still, even though what we're seeing seems to be very favorable, everyone is still very wary about, is this actually going to hold?
One of the ironies, I think, is that they're waiting to the very end, and even then, it was not a sure thing. Pins and needles, as you said, Rich. And yet, the initial embrace of the Japanese to this new situation was ironic, and I think the occupation, if we can get into that, was relatively smooth. And again, you would think it would have been just the opposite, but it wasn't.
I think it's a supreme example of the Japanese cultural emphasis on consensus. Consensus to go on to the end, to the 15th of August. When the consensus changed surrender, then suddenly that, what to us initially, certainly the initial occupying forces were struck by the fact that they weren't meeting fanatical resistance, that little kids were not coming up to them with grenades in their hands to blow them up, that there was this acceptance. But once the consensus shifted to acceptance, that's why basically the occupation went, from our perspective, with incredible smoothness compared to what we thought we might be facing.
Douglas MacArthur is one of the most controversial figures in American history. Without getting into the various controversies, there doesn't seem to be much controversy in terms of his term as overseeing the occupation. His reputation is very high. Talk about Douglas MacArthur and his handling of the occupation.
I think one of the distinctive features, positive features about Douglas MacArthur, and we could do another podcast about the negative features of Douglas MacArthur. But one thing about MacArthur was, if you lined up all the American top leaders in the 1940s, I would argue that Douglas MacArthur was probably the least tainted by racism of any of them. And the other thing was, there was nothing about MacArthur. Once the Japanese surrendered, there was no vengeance in the heart of Douglas MacArthur with respect to the Japanese people in general, or most of the Japanese. There were a handful of individuals, some of the militarists or whatever here, he was quite willing to settle accounts with. But he made, just a tremendous initial impression with his initial statements, we weren't going to try ordinary Japanese and et cetera.
So there is some retribution, though. I mean, as harmonious as it was, but the Nuremberg trials are well known. Less well known are the beginning of the Tokyo trials. Let's talk about that.
Well, the Tokyo, what happened in terms of the war crimes trials in Asia was we had the principal and the famous part of it is the Tokyo trials, which were of the top level leaders. And there were 28 individuals who were on trial, 25 were convicted, and I think it's 7 were ultimately executed. Yeah. But you also have to bear in mind that there were also B and C level trials. All of those were normally conducted at the locale of where the crime was committed. And that could be all over Asia, all the areas that the Japanese had occupied. The Tokyo trials didn't get started until after the Nuremberg trials got going. And obviously, the single most controversial aspect about the Tokyo trials is why wasn't Emperor Hirohito tried? And having spent a long time, I think what happened here was that in the fall of 1945, during the early months of the occupation, we finally agreed with the protestations issued by Japanese officials initially that their food situation was so critical they're going to be facing a famine in mid-1946. And MacArthur became convinced that this was true. And MacArthur also became convinced that the only way to head off famine in Japan in 1946 was with American food, which was not going to be an easy sell, to say the least. And there was a very real prospect that if Japan hit a famine-like condition, which would strike primarily in Honshu, where most of the population lived in an area of food deficit, so automatically they were going to be in great peril, that there would be civil disturbances that couldn't be controlled. And he thought that the emperor, as a force to represent stability, might be critical in trying to head off or ameliorate that situation. I think that is ultimately what was behind MacArthur's decision to urge that we not try the emperor, although he sent a very typical MacArthur message, which basically lied through his teeth. He said, he investigated the emperor and the emperor was not guilty of anything or whatever, which was not true. And that's how we got to the Tokyo trials. And as it turned out, and this is a story that I think deserves to be celebrated, because what happens is MacArthur, although there's a struggle, he eventually convinced President Truman to send food to the Japanese. And this is mostly the residual urban population because the cities have emptied out because of the food shortage. So, in fact, in Tokyo, there's about 2.5 million Japanese in the Tokyo region, and we're feeding every single one of them with American food. We actually saved more lives during the occupation than we took during the war. And then on top of that, one issue that comes up, which usually gets glossed over, is that part of the guarantees made to the Japanese about a surrender is we're going to have all the Japanese overseas repatriated. There are 6 million of those, civilian and military, just about even split. And they come back. And meanwhile, the slave laborers or laborers that Japan has brought in to mainly do their war industries, they're supposed to go home. And this is like a perfect storm set up for epidemics. And the guy who heads up the medical end of the occupation, Crawford Sams, he's a colonel. He'd never worked directly with MacArthur before. He came in for the occupation. And what's remarkable is that Crawford Sams, when he recognizes that they're facing this deadly set of epidemics, he breaks the Japanese medical organization loose from its control by the Imperial Army and mobilizes them and works with them to head off and control a whole medical textbook list of things. The leading Japanese historian of the first-generation historian of the occupation, Eiji Takame, says that basically what he and his Japanese colleagues accomplished was they saved, as Takame said, perhaps 3 million lives. Well, 3 million lives is virtually the exact number of Japanese who died in the entire war from 1937 to 1945. That's just the medical end of the occupation.
That I didn't know that. Wow. That's a staggering idea.
Basically, because at that point in time, people understood, which has been lost typically in the West, I think, is there's this stupendous disparity between the number of Japanese civilians who perished during the war as a result of the war, and those who died as a result of Japan's war. To my experience in dealing with people throughout Asia who lived in countries that were occupied by Japan. In fact, I just had an episode sort of confirming this just a couple days ago here in the museum, talking to a woman from Malaysia. And she was saying that her grandparents were very young during the Japanese occupation. They had terrible stories about that, passed on to her parents, passed on to her, and still very, very much alive in all of these nations, which is why, by all accounts, there's very troubled relations beneath the surface between the Japanese and most of the other people in Asia. The Chinese, particularly the Indonesians, particularly the Vietnamese, who suffered the greatest numbers. We've, in the U.S., we've almost totally lost sight of exactly how horrific this was. I think basically if you lined up all the dead civilians in the Asia-Pacific War, about 6 or 7% are Japanese. All the rest or others. Almost all of them are other Asians.
Chinese, Korean,
Filipinos,
Malaysian,
Burmese.
Vietnamese.
There's a death toll everywhere you go. This whole issue in 1945 is not whether anyone's going to die, it's who's going to die and who's already died, and whether we're going to give the Japanese a pass when they've been the principal cause of this. I've just been drafting up some chapters that talk about life in these Southeast Asian nations during Japanese occupation. And just reading the material that you can find about this, it's incredibly depressing to contemplate what went on, what it was like for these people to have experienced it. And I really feel, it's just, to me, so wrong that we neglect what happened during Japanese occupation. Conversely, and I was very conscious of this when I wrote my book, Downfall, what I did not want to do is only depict the people who have been victimized by the Japanese. I wanted to make it clear that I was following this, and I wouldn't have said it the way I say it now, that count all the dead and treat all the dead as sharing a common humanity. But I instinctively thought that was critical. That's why I start the book with a very graphic description of the Tokyo fire raid in March 1945, because I want to make it very clear that I'm not denying the common humanity of the Japanese. And I have a very graphic description of what it was like to be in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. And at that time, I was working on this back in the 1990s. We didn't have nearly as many rich sources as we have now on all these other places. And in terms of the new things that we have, just within the last 20 years or so, we've had all kinds of information about China, about all these other places that have illuminated and expanded our understanding of these things, and also more graphically describing innumerable episodes of what it was like to be occupied by Imperial Japan in World War II.
In the book Judgment at Tokyo, author Gary Bass describes a tense and quiet auditorium, listening as the diary of a Japanese soldier was submitted as evidence.
The naivete I possessed at the time of leaving the homeland has long since disappeared. Now, I am a hardened killer, and my sword is always stained with my blood. Although it is for my country's sake, it is sheer brutality. May God forgive me. May my mother forgive me.
The unprecedented destruction of the Second World War left tens of millions of people in Asia and Europe without a home and a very uncertain future. Historian and author Stephanie Hinnershitz is with us to explain more. Let's talk about this, because across the world, and including the United States, which we'll get to, people now have to deal with the consequences of World War II. Millions of homes have been destroyed. Millions of families' lives have been upended. Give us a sense of what the chaos was like. Let's start in Europe. We'll move to Asia, and then eventually the United States.
When the war ended, one of the big challenges for nearly everyone in Europe was the fact that there were borders that once existed that no longer exist. So you have people who are basically stateless, they're homeless, not only because their actual physical homes were destroyed during the war, but also just they don't necessarily have nations to return to when the war is over. So in Europe alone, there are anywhere between about 40 million, numbers upwards of 65 million displaced persons after the war.
That is just mind-boggling. I think that...
And all these migrations going on, too. I mean, let alone the displaced persons. And the animosity, too, between the groups, internally, where to go. People just getting pushed around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and as you said, Stephanie, literally not just homes, but state borders have shifted and changed, and you were one day in Poland, now you're in Germany, or you were in Germany, now you're in Poland, let alone obviously the Red Army's not going away. That changes. And this huge migration of Germans that had migrated, part of the Lebensraum, the whole reason for Germany went to war in the first place, all those Germans who had migrated east now have to migrate west. Where are they going to go? Their home was probably bombed. Talk about that. One
of the biggest forced relocations, all the different terms that you can apply to it, were these Germans who had no place to go to now. So within this larger number of the 40 to 65 million, but within that are these very large groups of Germans. And one of the really interesting things about this post-war period is that you get these two concepts or terms that start to take on a little bit more definite meaning. So displaced persons, the concept is not super unique because they are basically refugees. But the idea of here are people who have no home to go to, and they either can't or are unwilling to return home, whether that's because they're going to face persecution. Maybe they don't want to go back to places that are now under control of the Soviet Union. There's all different reasons why you have people who are displaced. They don't have a home to return to. This is something that basically the Allied forces are still going to be dealing with. They're going to step in with other different organizations under the UN, and they're going to be working to figure out what do you do with all of these people, including Germans, who really have no place to go. And they're still going to need assistance. So in many, many ways, the work of the Allies are not even close to being done when the war is over, because they have to tackle this problem of what do you do with all of these people.
The Allied military forces, primarily the British and the Americans, have to go almost overnight, go from prosecuting the war to protecting, as you said, up to 65 million people. How did that work?
Very dicey. The camps, the displaced persons camps that are going to be created, they are going to be run jointly by British and Americans, and also with UNRWA, UNRAA, and that they jointly administer these camps that are well-intentioned, but they are obviously trying to deal with a mass number of people. So you have even survivors of the Holocaust who are now displaced persons, people who are formerly slave laborers. And they're being put into these camps with the intention of helping them to get back on their feet and to be hopefully returned someplace. But it's very difficult to run them. Like you mentioned, you have a military force that's trying to administer these camps as best as possible.
Not what they were trained for.
No, not at all.
One of the things, Don, you talk about all the time when we've talked about are guys who were shot down and held in a prisoner of war camp. Well, what you always mention is that this is after being in an airplane accident, if you will, a major crash, which has a psychological impact, which we don't. So the military is attempting to help these people reconstruct some kind of life, but that's just physically, right? Materially. How are these people coping emotionally, psychologically? With the trauma of the largest event in human history, and they were at the center of it.
That's one of the criticisms. There will be some, I guess you could call them inspectors from the U.S. who will be sent to some of these displaced persons camps, especially throughout Austria and other places, where they will look and see what exactly are the living conditions of people who are in these camps. And one of the big criticisms is that, yes, basic needs are trying to be met, being housed and have shelter and food, but there's really not a lot being done at all for any of the trauma.
Well, and then at the center of it all, you mentioned and Don mentioned, were the millions of Jews who were the target of the Nazis, were the target of the Third Reich. So even if they could go home, why would they? Why would they go back? Certainly, why would you go back if you were a Jew who had lived in Poland and you lived in Auschwitz? Why would you return?
One of the other goals of these displaced persons camps were to help people get back on their feet economically. So one of the key goals was helping people find jobs. Right. So if you have that goal, that not only are you going to be housed and fed, and you need to be able to have some place to return to. And even if you're psychologically traumatized by what you went through, still the idea is you're going to be able to be self-sufficient.
And that presupposes that the economy, whether it's in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Hungary, Germany, you name it, is put back together.
Right.
I mean, these are all countries that had been under war, so their economies essentially had collapsed.
I talked to this German woman, and she said during the war she had moved to Berlin from Aachen. Right during this period, she was going to return home. She got on the train. Someone asked her where she was headed, and she said, Aachen. He said, I've just been there. There is no Aachen.
I mean, you can go through all the job training and you can, you're attended to medicinally and maybe even a little bit emotionally. But if there's no there, to what end? And then you have to face, well, okay, where will I go then? What's my new identity? Let's talk a little bit about Asia, Stephanie. Tell me, how was it similar and how was it different?
Similar, I would say, in that you're dealing with this post-war world where empires are crumbling or they no longer exist. So you had that decolonization that is going on in Europe and also in Asia. So that is still making this idea of who are you and where do you belong very complicated. I mentioned before the numbers, trying to get a handle on the number of displaced persons or refugees is very, very tricky. We went through this at the museum when we did the Liberation Pavilion. This was actually a really big debate that we had here in trying to figure out how many displaced persons, refugees were there in Asia. So I mentioned earlier, and Don mentioned as well, that there's this overwhelming number in Europe that could be 40 to 65 million. The numbers, when you're looking at, we'll take China, it's very difficult to actually come down to something. And part of that is, too, based on what the numbers a nation reports. So you've got Korea, you've got basically what used to be the Japanese Empire, but then also you're dealing with what used to be the French Empire. So you're starting to see a lot of these different...
Basically Indochina.
Yeah, Indochina. Yeah, so Korea and China and the Philippines, which is also going to go through its own transition as it transitions to being its own nation, not under U.S. control, not being a commonwealth and getting its independence.
And that happened so quickly.
Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting point. Again, overnight, under occupation by in Asia, whether it's Malaysia or Korea, etc., and then all of a sudden, overnight, your world is turned upside down. The Japanese are displaced. What comes in lieu of the Japanese?
Right. Now we're dealing with American occupation. So this begins the occupation program, and that's another sort of complicated thing to navigate. Are you still Japanese, but you're living under American occupation and having to get used to some of the different economic changes that are going to be going on under U.S. occupation?
We'll talk about that a little bit, about General MacArthur and his and the people that worked for and under him and how they administered what was an occupied enemy, a former enemy.
Yeah, it was. It's very interesting to look at the goals of occupation in Japan, and there were a couple different phases of it. So I would say one of the most interesting aspects of the way he administered occupation and trying to actually rebuild or reconstruct Japan was trying to do something that I think we might call like land redistribution. That's a more maybe, quote, radical way of putting it. But there were these Japanese families that had these conglomerates, these economic conglomerates. And one of the things that MacArthur wanted to challenge or sort of break down were those conglomerates. So trying to break apart those economic corporations that dominated so much and try and redistribute some of that land, try and redistribute some of the wealth, work with MacArthur and work with some of his aides there. So the reason why I bring that up is because I think it highlights MacArthur's approach and the U.S. approach to occupation is that we're not just going to occupy, right? We're not just going to feed them. That's really, really important. But how do you reshape a society in a way that might actually have a lasting legacy?
It's interesting, and I've certainly over the years, and I've gotten into discussions with people, historians even here at the museum, where I don't know of another instance in world history where one nation went to war, total war with another, defeated totally that enemy, and then rather than keeping their foot on their throat, they gave them a hand up. I know that's a little simplistic, but it's in essence, I think, but tell me what you think, Stephanie.
I think you have to question and you have to try and get a handle on what might sound kind of not crude, but simplistic. But what would the United States get out of treating a former foe the way that it did? So not only we do want to do a lot of humanitarian good, we want to help feed the people who are starving, but what does the United States achieve or accomplish? What can they benefit from? What can we benefit from in administering occupation this
really
way?
Good point. This is where the Cold War wraps into this.
Yep, that's exactly it, right?
Yeah, it's right behind the Marshall Plan and things.
And to follow up, because yes, that's part of the debate, but there's self-interest in it for the United. This is not humanitarian. This is not Mother Teresa. But I would suggest that if what's in your self-interest is actually in the self-interest of whom you're helping, it's a win-win. Ultimately, I don't care what the motives are necessarily for the Marshall Plan or et cetera. Yeah. If helping me helps them, all the better for all of us.
So with the displaced persons in Europe, in 1948, we have a Displaced Persons Act, which allows for some of these individuals who are struggling, many Jews who were survivors of the Holocaust and Nazi persecution, 1948, they start to come to the United States. So on one hand, that's great. We're doing something very humanitarian. On the other hand, like you mentioned, Don, we're in the early years of the Cold War now. So what can the United States get from bringing over some of these individuals who don't want to go live under the Soviet Union?
What we never think about, or we rarely think about, as we should, because we had displaced persons in the United States. At the beginning of the war, infamously, Japanese Americans were rounded up primarily on the West Coast and put into so-called internment camps. All right. What homes did they go back to?
I really do appreciate being able to talk about this in the context of bigger displacements and movements, because it's very important to think of it that way, because it was not a voluntary movement. And one of the groups was Japanese Americans, and they were referred to at the time as refugees. So a lot of magazines, a lot of periodicals actually looked at Japanese Americans as refugees, and they used that term. So that's not me projecting backward and saying, let's take this and use it. But yeah, they were tumbleweeds and refugees. They were people who really had no place to go. So it's all the same language when you're using it, whether it's for displaced persons or in China. It's that idea of the war created situations where people moved involuntarily. They had to move, and that happens right here in the U.S. too.
Give us an idea at how many ultimately Japanese Americans were displaced, interred. Both Japanese Americans and I know there were also Japanese nationalists who were living here. So give us the total and differentiate, please.
We used to say approximately 120,000, but now we know it was more 122,000, give or take, that were displaced from the West Coast and had to go into one of the camps. And then from there, get sort of spitballed out whether they go back or whether they go elsewhere. Within that number, about 82% were Nisei. So they were American citizens.
Right. So over 80,000 American citizens were thrown into camps in the United States.
So when those exclusion orders are lifted in January of 1945, so that's when Japanese Americans can legally return back to the West Coast and try and pick up the pieces of their lives. That is going to be incredibly difficult because this is almost, so 1945 through about 1947, this is a period where you basically see domestic terrorism against Japanese Americans who are trying to return back to their homes. You have white groups who are trying to firebomb their homes and they're trying to kill them. So they are allowed to go back, but why would you? Why would you go back?
Right. Well, And are there places to go back to?
Yeah, economically, what they have to go home to is certainly not what they left behind. Businesses, Japanese Americans sold their businesses off. They sold all their inventory. There's nothing to go home to there. Different, again, just homes. There really is nothing economically or even structurally to return home to in 1945.
And it's one of the biggest housing crunches this country's ever experienced.
Yeah.
The housing shortage is enormous.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Servicemen, can't get into housing.
Help us understand the entire scope of World War II, including the post-war period and displaced persons around the world.
Mm-hmm. I think there's material aspects of that, just trying to struggle and regain and be able to live and survive, but also just having an identity. What does it mean to live after this very massive event? Right. Like, you survived. You gave the number, right? This massive number of people who did not survive. So I think it's important to think about, well, how do those who did, what do they make of it, right? What does it mean to have survived this very, very enormous fatal event? What does it mean for a displaced person? What does it mean for someone who survived the Holocaust to go into a camp and then come to the United States when so many others did not? I think trying to grapple with that touches absolutely every part of the globe.
We obviously at the museum, but in movies and films and in literature, and so we grapple with 39 to 45. I don't think we've come close yet to grappling with 45 onward.
No, absolutely not.
In a letter to the American judge at Nuremberg, President Truman wrote, "An undisputed gain coming out of Nuremberg is the formal recognition that there are crimes against humanity." Historian Rebecca Erbelding joins us. Let's talk a little bit about the Nuremberg trials. What was, again, this is unprecedented. Set the scene for us, and what happened at Nuremberg?
The Allies have lots of debates during the war as to what to do with the leaders, with the Nazi leaders. There wasn't a lot of legal precedent for prosecuting people for war crimes, certainly for waging proactive war. The Allies are kind of making up a lot of these charges out of thin air, declaring them as legal, and then trying to try people. When we talk about the Nuremberg trials, we're really, I think what most people think of is what is actually known as the International Military Tribunal, the IMT. It is the major war crimes trial. 22 major Nazi criminals put on trial for almost a year. The trial opens in November 1945 and lasts until the following September. There are subsequent Nuremberg trials, and so that's why we pluralize that word. And those are focused on doctors, on industrialists, on a total of about 199 defendants from all walks of German life, leadership of different organizations that the Americans then try subsequent to this international trial, this major international trial. The Nazis who are in the international trial, the 22 leading Nazis, are Hermann Goering. They're people who work in propaganda. They're people who worked in the different regions of German-controlled territory and had different jobs. They kind of picked from a group of leadership, kind of the representative people that the Allies wanted to try. And they were tried on conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the Holocaust is a part of the trial. It is not the majority of it. Most of it is about this proactive waging of war. And of course, many of the defendants give what is now known as the Nuremberg defense. Basically, we were just following orders. It wasn't our decision. It was Hitler. And of course, Hitler is dead at this point. So it's very convenient that they just say they're following orders. But they are tried on those grounds, and with the Holocaust as a part of that.
And there were, yes, and some of the other defendants, Albert Speer, Joachim, that Minister of Armaments, and Hitler's architect,
Speer,
Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, Kaltenbrunner, the whole gang, and
that they could find and that hadn't taken their own lives.
And there were other trials, not just at Nuremberg, but around Europe. That there were many trials. Can you estimate essentially how many Germans ultimately were held accountable and responsible by some, whether it was American or Russian or Polish, for authorities over the next couple of years?
So you've asked a historian a question with a lot of caveats, and I have to throw it back at you a little bit because, like, how many people are tried? How many are held responsible? Which is, I think, to some extent subjective. So how many people are found guilty? I think the Allies are trying, the Western Allies, I'll speak about the Western Allies. The Western Allies are trying to run actual trials with a judge, sometimes with witnesses, with testimony, and where the defendants are allowed to have representation most of the time. A lot of the trials are based on certain camps. So there is an Auschwitz trial in the Soviet zone. There is a Bergen-Belsen trial that the British run. The US run Dachau trials, and they use Dachau as kind of a general place where different kinds of crimes are tried. Sometimes the crimes are against Allied soldiers. So Allied airmen who are shot down, there'll be a trial. One of the first ones is held at Caserta, just outside of Naples, trying a German major who had participated in the death of an Allied airman. And so there are trials large and small. I would say probably in terms of how many people are tried, we're in the tens of thousands. How many people are convicted is much lower than that. And how many people actually received the justice that they deserved is much, much lower than that. And how many people walked away is much more than the number of people who were tried. The Allies are performing triage. A lot of times, as you see with the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, they're picking representative people to try, knowing that they absolutely can't try everybody. And I think as the 1940s go on, there's less appetite from the American people for these trials and to continue to have their sons overseas as military police supervising people for these trials. And then you also get wrapped up in the Cold War. You know, there's a battle between the Americans and the Soviets and the British.
And Germany was off on the prize.
And Germany is often the beneficiary of that because, you know, we need powerful allies in Europe and we can't have a weak Germany here. So even as we're occupying, there are compromises being made.
This is, you know, you could make a case that the 1945 is as important a single year as there has ever been in world history.
I absolutely agree with you that 1945 is a pivotal year. And I think when you go back, you can trace almost any modern debate that we have, almost every decision that we make to something that is happening in 1945 and is just continuing to ripple today.
Dawn, we've spent the last few weeks discussing the events of 1945. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that many of those events really are fundamental to shaping the modern world we live in today. What do you think?
Well, I think they are if we remember them, and that's our obligation. We can forget. It's the easiest thing to do. And sometimes remembering is very difficult because it can be awfully painful. Even when it's joyous, I think it's poignant to place yourself, if you can, on the spot that a certain event in history took place, is to put yourself in the stream of life. You're part of the story. You're consciously remembering that you're part of the story. And if you write it down, all the better, because then you're a true participant. That's the importance of history.
Some of the events of this year this was a particularly eventful year, 1945. We began a few weeks ago discussing the liberation, if I can use that term, of the extermination center at Auschwitz-Birkenau.
Yeah.
And then we marched through some very difficult things, the horrific battle for Manila, the American Marines capturing Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, the continuing bombing of both Germany and the firebombing in Japan, and then, of course, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of this in one 12-month period. Extraordinary events, very difficult to, hard enough for us just to recount and recapture. Imagine trying to live through it all.
It's too much. It's really just to hear you, the litany, you just recalled a small segment of it. And it's overpowering. It's Humpty Dumpty falling from the wall, and he's totally cracked into pieces. Can they ever be put back together again? People must have wondered after the war, as they walked into another world, what's going on here?
Speaking about how hard it was, I can't imagine being a parent during the war. And now in 1945, when he's either coming home or he's not, and imagine if he comes home either wounded, let alone just as if he comes home and you have to bury him, your life will never be the same.
Well, you said a lot there, brother. You said it to me earlier this morning, and it really struck me because I felt a real sharp pain, a sting of guilt about my grandparents that I never asked them, all the interviews I've done, I never asked them what it felt like to have that gnawing, constant, incessant sensation of you're going to lose him or not. Letters don't come in. And it's just an awful thing. It's just an awful thing. And when I finally talked to one of my aunts, she said that she was pregnant before my uncle went over and served with the big red one. But every time she looked at the baby, she thought of her husband. Mm. It was a painful reminder. It should have been a joyous moment. Is his father ever going to see him again? Let alone am I ever going to see him again? I did a biography years ago of the American intellectual Louis Mumford. He lived in a small country town up in New York State called Armenia. His son, at 18, volunteered, and he went in as a replacement in Italy. And, of course, replacements show up, and they're considered bad luck because they haven't worked with the unit. They don't know the protocol, and maybe they'll get us all killed here. Sometimes the guys wouldn't call replacements by their names. They didn't want to know their names because they'd probably be gone pretty soon. Well, he was killed, and his parents, who lived by themselves and were not young, and real young, and they were in their early 50s, they got the letter. And the rest of their lives, and Mumford lived into his 90s and was a very productive man, but was haunted by that boy's death. He asked me one time to fetch a painting for him, and George O'Keeffe he wanted to show me. And O'Keeffe was a friend of his. And he said, go upstairs. I'd never been on the second floor of their house. And it's in the bedroom on the right. And I walked up and opened the door, and my God, I walked into a time warp. It was his name was Geddes, after the Scottish botanist Patrick Geddes, who was Mumford was an accolade of his, and I just froze. It was the boy's room, Geddes' room, the day he left for the war. Nothing had changed. Mm. The toothbrushes, the books, the boots, his fishing rods, his shotgun. They shot rabbits with. Sacred space. I asked him what was the saddest moment of his life. He said, well, that was the deliverance of the telegram. But he said, even worse was when we got the word on the radio that the war was over, the war in Europe at that point. And we were a farm community, and everyone got in their trucks and rode around and rang cowbells and blew whistles and things and formed an ad hoc kind of parade. And all my wife and I did is retreat to the kitchen so we couldn't hear the sounds. And we just cried. That was it for him. And then we had to make the decision. We never thought of this. We were going to bring him home. The government offered us the opportunity to bring him home and bury him, even in Arlington if he wished. And after tremendous soul searching. And he said, my God, you can't believe how difficult that decision was, not to be able to see his grave perhaps, but at the same time to honor him. And then I thought it was over in a sense, but there was no termination because I wanted to know how he died, because I wanted to know if he died with anybody. I wanted to know if he died alone. And he didn't have any buddies. So we wrote to his company commander, and his company commander did not know who he was. And they started to ask questions. He was very good about this. And they did find a kid who went on the scouting mission with him, but wasn't with him when he was shot by a sniper. So he died alone in the Italian woods, only 6 or 7 days after arriving at the war front. There was this cliff, this ravine between us, the gap. There was no closure. That's what closure means, the searing together of the two lives, life, death, termination, prayer, remembrance. And we went through none of that.
That's why they had to keep the room exactly in the state.
Exactly. Just the way it was. And it happened to me an earlier time in life when my grandmother sent me next door to a young man's house who I adored. And they sent me over there to get something. And they sent me upstairs to this young man's bedroom. And he was a tanker in Tunisia. And he was killed. His tank was immolated. He burned to death. I was told that later. But even as a young kid at age 6, I knew that something august had happened in here. I don't know what it was, but it was scary. It was his room just the way it was. And I thought, why don't they, even as a kid, I thought this, why don't they clean this up just to try to erase the memory so it's not with them all the time? And I asked my mom, and she said, they have to have it.
Well, it's almost, I would imagine, that some part of your heart, some part of your brain can pretend that he's going to walk in and everything's going to be there for him just as it was. He's going to walk in. He's coming home tomorrow. He'll be here tomorrow.
And if this stuff isn't here, did you forget about me?
Yeah. Yeah, what happened?
Did life go on?
It's like when the guys would come back on the 8th Air Force, when they would come back and they were reported missing, but they weren't, and they came back to their Nissen huts, and they had been their foot lockers had already been cleared out.
Yeah.
I can't imagine parents. Of course you're going to keep the foot locker there. Of course you're going to keep his baseball mitt there. Of course you are.
Yeah.
Don, I can't think of any better way to conclude our series. Well, you concluded your great book, The Story of World War II, by quoting a veteran. I think it would be appropriate if we conclude our series with that quote.
This is a writer, very popular in his time, Robert Crichton. Robert wrote a memoir, and this is just a section from it. This is 30 years after the war, on the anniversary of the day that he was wounded. And this is just a small segment from it. The greatest defeat in anything is to forget. Forgetfulness dismantles time, the ultimate gift of life. Death might be seen as a condition of running out of time. If something is forgotten, it never happened. It is correct to say that the loss of memory murders life. Knowing this, I keep on forgetting, failing to find any acceptable reason for this willful, even suicidal forgetfulness. I have come to blame it on the war because I remember the war. Well, there's the poignancy of it. To bring up the war was to spin him into tremendous depression. The death, he suffered post-traumatic distress in the war. All these haunting, horrible memories he had. And yet he knew that if he forgot, he'd murder the experience. He'd murder the war. He'd murder what he'd done. It would all disappear. And he didn't want to slip. It was bad enough getting old, but he didn't want to slip into a state of ahistorical inactivity. And that, of course, is forgetting.
Of course, and I would imagine it would be, it's probably too strong to say, but murdering himself in a way, because
it is.
And what he, however it affected him emotionally and psychologically, he still achieved something, and he still was part of something that was necessary, and that was an experience that was shared millions of times around the world. I was thinking when you were describing the Mumfords and your next door neighbor and the Gold Star parents, those were experiences, the way you so eloquently describe them, that happened in America hundreds of thousands of times.
Isn't it something?
Across the world, tens of millions of times. Unimaginable to us, but that's why we can't forget.
No, you can't.
Don, it's been a pleasure and an honor discussing the events in 1945 with you the last few weeks.
It was. I'm glad we signed up for the tour.
See you next time, pal.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this podcast series. We want to give a special thanks to our sponsor, the Long family, for their generous support of this series, and to our guests, Richard Frank, Doris Kearns-Goodwin, Rebecca Erbelding, John McManus, Stephanie Hinnershitz, as well as Patricia Clarkson and Gary Sinise. We thank you. To learn more about the American experience in World War II, visit the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The museum's website has a dedicated page for this podcast series where you can find articles and recommended reading about 1945.